Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Hello everybody, welcome to today's Wednesday lunch here at the Divinity School. I'm Sharon White, I'm the organizer of the series, so thank you all for coming out today in another. Are there any, before we start, let me do our usual housekeeping. I think our head chef today was Blair. Thank you to Blair and our entire crew for Does everybody know what the three milks of the cake are? Does anybody else not know and they want to know? Oh, sure. What was it? It's evaporated milk, sweetened condensed milk, and heavy cream. Yeah. That's all your calories. All your calories for today. No more eating. We do ask that you clean up after yourselves on your way out. If you could put your, looks like these are not compostable, right? No compost?
They're not.
Do not compost your plate. Compost your leftovers. Put your plate into the garbage. Put your silverware into the soapy bags. Are there any announcements?
Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who have not, there are inmates in the room that have not signed up for tomorrow night's event. This is your last opportunity. So if you have not signed up for the inmate dinner, please do so today.
Anyone else? Any announcements? Okay. Then I'll just get right to today's speaker. I'm really thrilled to be here today, even with the snow. He even came over without a coat. I'm a Chicago person. So our speaker for today is Dr. Chad Broughton. Is that good? That works. Broughton. We're going to say sort of the Scots way. He's a senior lecturer in public policy studies and the college, and he's the author of Boom Bust Exodus, the Rust Belt, the Maquilas, and a Tale of Two Cities, which is a ground level look at the rapid transition to a globalized economy from the perspective of people who've been most deeply affected by it. So he'll tell us more, of course. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Broughton.
All right. Thanks for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And thanks for making Mexican food. That's great. Okay, so Boom Bust Exodus. This project started for me in 2002 with a single event when when Maytag announced that it would close its big appliance factory in Galesburg, Illinois. Galesburg, Illinois is about 3 hours west of here, near the Mississippi River. Anybody been to Galesburg before? All right, three people, great. So it's a town of about 32,000 people, and I had just moved there to Galesburg to join the faculty at Knox College, a little liberal arts college there. I just finished my PhD in sociology here in 2001, and I grew up in a small town in Indiana, but not a factory town like Galesburg, and so I didn't really understand what was happening around me at the time when this announcement happened. People were saying that the town would die, that it would become a ghost town. People were angry, they were sad, they were somewhat resentful of Maytag. The town was losing its economic anchor. This was a place that employed about 2,000 people at about $15 an hour. These are paid twice the minimum wage. Was a route into the middle class for folks in Western Illinois. It's also the largest taxpayer in the area, has $60 million payroll, so that economic impact was clear. And it would have an economic impact, of course, on families. One family, Jackie and Shannon Cummings, slides here they are, would go from earning $76,000 in today's dollars back in 2002 to earning $37,000 today. It's about half of what they had earned 10 years ago. And And so that means no trips to Disneyland, not going out on Friday night, less expensive shoes for Christmas. Life began to narrow. And that part was clear, the economic impact was clear, but something seemed to be happening beyond that, something beyond the lost paychecks in Galesburg. And I wanted to figure out what that was, and that's what started me on what would become a 12-year research and writing journey. So a year into my research, I'll tell you a story. In 2003, about 13 students and I tagged along with 150 Maytag workers, the machinists that represented the workers in Galesburg, as they went to an annual shareholders meeting in Newton, Iowa, which was, of course, Maytag's headquarters for over a century. They were there to protest Maytag's decision to close the factory. There were some good speeches that day, some watery coffee, but what struck me the most about that protest was what the workers chanted as they walked around the hotel, the shareholders meeting. It was USA, USA. It wasn't about corporate greed or Mexicans stealing their jobs. It was USA. And so it struck me as odd, this patriotic reaction. So I talked to the workers there to figure out what it meant. And the first point was pretty straightforward, and it's depicted on there's this slide too. Later on in 2004, a state senator from the area would join their campaign and actually barnstormed union halls all over Illinois with two of the machinist leaders in his effort to become Illinois senator. But anyway, that was a little bit in the future. Back to 2003. So the first part of this message was basically economic nationalism here. Maytag, make it in the USA, or the USA won't make it. Right? The idea that we need an economy that works from the ground up with good jobs that build the middle class, not one that promises that wealth will trickle down from the top. Right? That is pretty straightforward. But as I began to better understand how the workers saw the world, it became clear that USA chant went beyond that, went deeper. It was about the idea of America, about how Americans ought to treat one another. After all, generations of Maytag leaders, Maytag family themselves, and the workers, they all sort of abided by a set of shared expectations, that went beyond the black and white of legal contracts or collective bargaining agreements. Right? Maytag, after all, as you probably know, was a very traditional company where for over a century tradition really mattered. Fred Maytag, for instance, had the following inscribed on the wall at the Maytag headquarters at 1 Dependability Square. Our management must maintain a just balance among the interests of consumers, employees, share owners, and the public. Although these groups may apparently compete in their short-term goals, their long-range interests coincide, for none can long benefit unless the needs of all are served. He also looked out, Fred Maytag did, for his hometown of Newton. He, for instance, insisted that a new factory be incorporated within Newton's city limits so to pay its fair share of taxes. So it may sound quaint or nostalgic to talk about fairness, loyalty, and honor in the context of a global economy. But that old-fashioned stuff, the shared expectations, the sense of mutual obligation, the commitment to your hometown, those are the things, the threads from which the American social fabric is woven, right? In Galesburg and across America. If everyone is purely looking out for their own interests in the short term, the threads come apart and the social fabric rips at the seams. That big appliance factory closing occurred amid a historic following of America's industrial core. Jackie and Shannon Cummings were but 2 of 5.8 million Americans who lost their jobs in manufacturing in the 2000s. That's 1 out of every 3 just a massive decline, and really contributes a lot to what we hear about, the erosion of the middle class, right? We hear a lot about the top 1% getting all the gains of growth in the new economy, right? But it's also happening in Galesburg, Illinois, right? And places like it. Downward mobility, that also contributes to this growing gap. In fact, the Maytag case study is a good example for seeing how the gains at the top for executives and for investors actually come at the direct expense of workers at the bottom. So you know those public opinion polls that say, is the country going in the right direction or not? Well, people in Galesburg more and more are saying, no, it's going in the wrong direction, right? And it was about more than jobs. It was about family. It was about one's hometown. It was about one's country. Everything seemed to rest on the razor's edge in 2003. And chanting USA at that shareholders meeting was their warning to the rest of us. I soon realized, though, that people at the rally, including myself, didn't have a clue what the new refrigerator factory would be like in Reynosa, where it was headed. What did the world look like from the point of view of the workers there? Why were they there in Reynosa in the first place? Right? So Galesburg's story was a transnational story now, and that became the only way that it made sense to tell it. So my project expanded, and I went to Reynosa, Mexico 5 times from 2003 to 2013. Here are a few shots. There's Plaza Principal, downtown Reynosa. Some Maquilas. There's a family that lives out in the colonias. A family where the father worked at Maytag for a while, Maytag in Reynosa. So we spoke to, I went with a friend and a colleague, we spoke to Mexican Maytag workers, we spoke to local government officials, we spoke to local union leaders, grassroots organizers, border scholars, anyone we could find really, who had a perspective on this. So Reynosa is a city of about 1 million, though nobody really knows for sure. They're at the southern tip of Texas, right across from McAllen and Mission, Texas, right across the Rio Grande. And so in Galesburg, that factory was an economic anchor for decades for that little community. Whereas in Reynosa, this was but one of 150 factories in this exploding border town. This is a city where workers in the export factories put in 2 million hours each month. One city each month, 2 million hours of work. These factories are called maquiladores or maquilas, and they're everywhere. And here in Reynosa was NAFTA's biggest boom. It grew faster than Juarez and Matamoros and Tijuana in the NAFTA years. And I kind of tell that story in the book. And all despite the cartel violence, the endemic corruption, and the uneven development there. So I want to tell you about one of the workers, Maria de la Luz Cordero. Like so many workers, Maria de la Luz came from El Campo, the countryside, at a young age. At 15, she altered her birth certificate to work at a General Motors maquiladora, now Delphi. After about 13 years there, in 2001, she started to miss work. Terrible headaches and dizziness weren't unusual in a place where, as she put it, the smoke in the air smelled of plastic, or where women whispered about abortos, or miscarriages. She had cancer. She said, I just about went crazy. I got really scared. She went through chemotherapy and radiation while her children, ages 8, 4, and 3 at the time, watched her grow skinny and bald. She was eventually fired from the maquila for her absences. And what amazes me, though, about Maria de la Luz's story is that despite all that happened to her, she still felt blessed to be in Reynosa. When her family back in southern Mexico in San Luis Potosí called her and asked her, do you want to come home? She would say, no, I'm happy here, where I am, with my children. The maquila, she said, offered something secure and certain. A tiny Christmas bonus, for example, gave her something beyond the money itself, something intangible. Working in the Maquilas meant that she wouldn't have to say, as she had that Christmas to her children, sorry, sometimes Santa Claus makes a mistake. The Maquilas made her a better mother, she said, and it gave her hope that at least her life was moving in the right direction. She said to us, although the work pays poorly, at least there is something for the kids and we battle. I'll never forget when she said that. At least there is something for the kids and we battle. Maria de la Luz was tough as nails and she battled. She couldn't move up into engineering or management herself. She was stuck in this dead-end job, but she hoped that in the border at the schools that are better there, with more exposure to English, with broader opportunities in employment for women, maybe her kids could. So the maquiladoras. Oh, okay. Right. Okay, so the maquiladoras, I learned, were filled almost entirely with Veracruzanos. These internal migrants had come from rural Veracruz, hundreds of miles south of Reynosa. Like African Americans coming north to Cincinnati, Chicago 50 or 100 years ago, these rural Southerners were coming to their industrial promised land in the north, but lived segregated on Reynosa's outskirts, and really transformed this border city in the last 20 years. And here's, I'll give you a sense of how it looks now on the outskirts of town. Here's some government subsidized housing going up on the outskirts of this border town. Here's what it looked like in 2003. So this is farmland that will be converted into housing 10 years later, in 2013. And they really pack in too. I mean, if you do a close-up here, you see just how many people are being packed in at the border. So the border has been absolutely transformed. And to understand what was happening at the border, I realized that we had to go further south to see why people were leaving. Because, it was the elbow grease of the folks at the border really that was transforming Reynosa, right? And so just as I needed to travel to Reynosa to understand what was happening in Galesburg, I needed to travel to Veracruz to understand what was happening in Reynosa. And so I began to imagine the book as a set of interwoven narratives from these three very different but interdependent places. See, they're interdependent. So in Veracruz, we spoke to village mayors, locals, farmers, and field hands, and we learned the policy story behind Exodus North in the NAFTA era, which I described in the book. Sort of moves between the policy stories and the people stories. But we also looked at very human dilemmas that people faced in rural Mexico, and that brings me to the final story, which is the Exodus story, boom bust Exodus. So, these slides of northern Veracruz. Okay, so imagine a blistering hot day in the Gulf Coast village of Barra de Cazones. It's 2007, and these two brothers, Ishmael and Emilio Fuentes, 38 and 40 respectively, are debating whether it's the right thing to do to leave their hometown of Barra de Cazones. And they've had a few modelos, they're drinking, and they get into this debate that lasts about 4 hours. It's just fascinating and rich. And so a little context, Ishmael, on the left there, works as a migrant farm worker in the United States and has for many years. And so he works there for 6 to 9 months here, and then returns to Barra de Cazones for the remainder of the year. Emilio, on the other hand, on the right there, has never left Mexico and thinks it's wrong to leave Mexico, although he struggles with that. And so now I'm going to read a short excerpt from the book. Ishmael begins. People do not emigrate because they're stupid, Emilio. People who leave Veracruz, they make progress in their lives. Emilio, look, there are two different kinds of ambition. My highest ambition is my family. His highest ambition is money. But with the money he makes, he cannot have the family he wants. If I went to the States and came back once a year, my children could become drug addicts or delinquents. Then he pointed across the table at his well-groomed teenage son, Lenny. He said, he wouldn't be talking about going to university right now if I weren't here. Sure, you can see that my house is more humble, but I have family security and Ishmael doesn't. There are two different kinds of ambition. Mine is real and his is a fantasy. Amelia looked directly at Ishmael. I want to tell you something. The United States is never going to be your country. Ishmael. Well, of course not. I love Mexico. Amelia. Well, what are you doing for Mexico? Ishmael. I'm not doing it for Mexico. I'm doing it for me. You have to look out for yourself. For God's sakes, Amelia, if you don't go to the richest country in the world, you won't do anything in your life. Amelia. For me, it's just an adventure. It's a huge land to want to conquer, a land more difficult than your own. With my family, I have a plan for my life. Him? He is not from the U.S. and he is not from here. If I fall, at least I know where I've fallen. Half of the working age population of this little Gulf Coast village had left, and its social fabric had frayed. A small mayor told me, for instance, that the hardships and the long separations of migration had broken up many families. And in fact, he spent half of his time adjudicating property disputes between estranged couples. So that's what Emilio feared. So he, like many, have stayed, just like many in Galesburg, like Jackie and Shannon Cummings have stayed. They've chosen to stick it out in the rural communities, even with less. So those are three glimpses into three places where the economic changes of the NAFTA era hit hardest. The displaced Galesburg workers chanting USA, like Jackie and Shannon Cummings. Love that jacket. Leather jacket with a flag on it. The maquiladora workers like Maria de la Luz, in the borderlands, working the jobs that Jackie and Shannon once had at a fraction of wages, but with the hope that their kids can have something better. And real Mexicans, like Ishmael and Emilio, facing life-defining decisions about work, family, and nation, amid dislocating change and depopulation. In the book, I also attempt to show how all of us are caught up in these forces sort of swirling around us and over us. Right? We may benefit, for example, as consumers, when we buy something that comes across the border made by Maria de la Luz. Or we may benefit when we buy cheap tomatoes picked by Ishmael or other migrant farm workers. Or when we buy cheap pork from America's slaughterhouses, which often profit at the expense of unauthorized Mexican immigrants. We may also benefit as consumers and investors when a little, or actually a big, union shop is shuttered in a place like Galesburg, Illinois. Even if Jackie and Shane have to struggle with less and contribute less economically. But as global citizens, I think it's essential, maybe even our responsibility, to listen to the voices of the people bearing globalization's burdens and to heed the protesters' warning that the cost of all this creative destruction, to use Joseph Schumpeter's description, the cost of all this creative destruction may extend well beyond those most immediately affected. And that all of this, the erosion of the middle class, growing inequality in America, may be tearing at our social fabric in ways that we may not fully understand. So a decade after Maytag's shuttering, the relative equality of factory life, where people earned about the same wage and had about the same benefits, that they're all equal in that factory, gave way to widespread inequality. So it's sort of a window into what's happened across America. A handful from the factory actually today earn more, even adjusted for inflation, than they had a decade earlier, especially those that ended up on the railroad. The BNSF railway company has one of its biggest hubs there in Galesburg, and those are good union jobs paying $20 to $30 an hour. And that actually is a business that has benefited from growing international trade. In general, though, today, in Galesburg, people are getting by on less. But the book looks at how people there have found their niche, tending patients at a hospital, working in an elementary school, or coaching a junior high basketball team. I quickly understood that former Maytag workers didn't want to be viewed with pity or as victims. Jackie and Shannon, for example, went back to school. They scrimped and saved. They went to yard sales. And they scrambled from job to job across the region, but eventually settled near home in jobs that they liked and found more meaningful than the work that they had at Maytag, even though their incomes were halved. As Jackie said, I think we're just little old farm girls at heart. We love apple pie, baseball games. We're just kind of cheesy Midwesterners. I am too, for the record. I didn't write this book with a particular agenda in mind. It started with that closing announcement in 2002, and the journey eventually took me 2,000 miles south and lasted 12 years. I'm a slow worker. But because I've had a decade to look at these changes in people's lives on both sides of the border, I think I've seen how people make the best of what they have, how they do what needs to be done, and how their lives unfold over time, and that's, I believe, at the heart of the book. And writing this book introduced me to some remarkable people on both sides of the border, like Maria de la Luz, resilient people who are doing what they have to do to, sacrifice and make sure that their children have some kind of future. I just want to end with what Maria de la Luz said, which was that there's something for the kids that can be battle, and that's ultimately what the book is about, the battle. Thank you.
Any questions?
Well, first off, I have an uncle who's from Newton, Iowa. He used to pick up chicks by saying that that's where the Big Newton was invented. Yeah, I don't know how effective that was, but yeah.
Very low.
Not heard that one.
Yeah, I'm curious if in sort of the decision to migrate to go to one of the border towns versus becoming a migrant worker or trying to immigrate to the United States, if there were clear reasons to choose one over the other, or if it's sort of just coincidence of the height, where you find yourself, who you know.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question, and it does, fate does play a role, as you suggest, but in general, it's traditionally been men that have come across the border. It's a little more risky, and the reward is greater. Obviously, the wages are higher on this side, and if you're working in the Maquilas, you're earning probably about $1.50 an hour. As I suggested, the steadiness of the work is important. You can leave one place and go to another place, another factory, and find work that same day. The work is abundant, and that's important. So some people in the book that I follow need those hours, and the overtime and the security for their family is important. And so one person in particular that I'm thinking of, Flora, ended up stuck in the border because she felt it was too risky to cross with the Coyote that particular time. She had done it before it. So she ended up stuck there. And so, she had to work overtime to even get enough to sort of support her family. It's the kind of jobs that are good if you're coming right out of high school in the South, and you come north and you live with an uncle and you're not paying rent and you can work a lot young and healthy, maybe go to school at night, that's the kind of person that might be able to capitalize on what's happening at the border. But for somebody like Laura Flora, who's a single mother, it's pretty rough. And so there is that temptation to go across, but with the greater rewards comes more risk. Yeah. Another question?
Just another question. How do you find the interviewees?
So it's a little different depending on the place, but do you want me to talk about a particular place?
No, general. That's
Just
okay.
general?
Yeah.
Okay, so, well, in Galesburg it was easy because I lived there. I just sort of walked into an ethnography, really, which is great as an ethnographer. I wanted to do something that was deeply felt locally, and this was the thing. Rumors were swirling in 2001 when I arrived, and it seems like everybody was connected to that factory. I played basketball with one of the managers there, and so I would talk to him. I'd interview him. He took me on a tour of the plant when it was still running, and then you've heard of a snowball sample, right? That's basically what I did. I just learned about people that work. So maybe not. So basically, you get to know people that work at the factory, and it wasn't hard to do that. And then you learn from them and work through their social networks to develop a snowball sample. And so I interviewed lots of people. I ended up focusing on people that could provide me with the most historical context in the beginning of the book. So I did some sort of oral history interviews with a guy that worked there for 40 years, who was the union president for a long time, and that was just wonderful. I love that. 10 interviews with him, I think. Really interesting to hear about the history of the place and what it was like in the 1960s in its heyday, the post-war years. But for the last 10 years, about how people's lives have changed, I focused on 4, I would say, emblematic stories, or emblematic family types, including Jackie and Shannon Cummings. In Reynosa, I felt more like I was trying to be at least an investigative reporter. You kind of go from place to place, and it was amazing actually, because the hospitality down there. We showed up with our backpacks in 2003, my friend and I, Josh, and we went to this kind of Ocean Fest in the hotel, and we were like, "What are we doing? We have no idea what's going on." But the next day, we walked up to the Plaza Principal, and there was a human rights sign. And I said, "Oh, let's go in there." And we ended up meeting some people that became actually lifelong friends, artists, and they started driving us around Reynosa and hooking us up with people who would later hook us up with other people, and we ended up talking to, like, the next day to the Secretary of Economic Development, and it was amazing. Basically, they would take us to somebody, we'd interview them, they'd throw us in their car, and they'd take us to somebody else. It was great. And Veracruz was much the same, except it was more like get in the back of the pickup truck and we'll bounce around. That was a lot of fun. Yes, ma'am.
We used to live in a smallish town in northwestern Illinois.
Oh, okay.
A town called Freeport, which you may be acquainted with to some extent. And one of the major employers there was Microsoft division of Honeywell, that big corporation. And they decided... Oh, I'm sorry. Microswitch. I apologize.
Microswitch.
No knocks on Microsoft. Microswitch. And they decided to move much of their operations to New Mexico, right on the border. That was a clue. And a lot of people, didn't get the better jobs that they thought they would get, or got laid off. I wasn't working for Microsoft, but I couldn't find a job in the town. And eventually they moved across the border into Mexico. I forget the name of the small town. But it was really tore a lot of people in Freeport apart. It was really, really tough. But what you said about Galesburg reminds me so much of Freeport.
Yeah.
It was a larger town, and it probably didn't hit it as bad as Galesburg got hit. But all the same, it was much the same effect.
Yeah.
Globalization, ouch. More than ouch.
Yeah, and I think, that my students don't always get it, and I don't think they're always super sympathetic to what's happening in places like Galesburg, especially given the context of this place and its understanding of how the economy works. And so, just like get over it, adapt, right? And that's what people in Galesburg were saying too to themselves as best they could. But the thing is, I think what's so key about this is that it's not like you're in a career in your 20s and you're bouncing from place to place, kind of trying to get traction somewhere, but learning skills along the way, right? These are people who are 20 years in at a job, not a career, it's a job. They have a pension, 10 more years they have retirement, and really good health care. And so, when you have a mortgage and a family and your midlife, and you have to start over again, and you weren't particularly good at school in the first place, like it, and it's not so easy to go back and do the retraining. It sounds nice that we all as consumers benefit, right? And there's that benefit of free trade is diffuse, we're told, but it's in the aggregate is bigger than the costs, because those are very concentrated. We see those; they're visible, right? And then so because of the benefit to consumers, we can have more taxes, and we can use those revenues to pay for retraining, and then everybody wins. The consumer wins, investors win, and even those people that are upskilling win. But it's much messier than that, and so but it's it's a complicated picture. I try to show more than tell in this one, but I think that one of the messages towards the end, I hope, is that people find a way to get by, and Jackie and Shane Cummings they like their jobs more. Jackie's working with at a hospital with seniors, and she loves it. She said, I would never have realized that I would love this work so much. Making like $11 an hour, but, and she doesn't know what she's going to do about her retirement, but she loves her work. And so people they figure it out. But you can see it though. I mean, Medicaid enrollments have doubled even before Obamacare was implemented. And, the percentage of low-income children in the schools has gone up. Tax burden has been shifted more to homeowners. So it's they're sort of these effects that push things in the wrong direction. But people stay. I guess that's one of the most surprising things to me is that most people just stuck it out. Yeah. Another question? Yeah.
So you suggested rather strongly that Maria de la Luz's cancer was caused, or at least in some way connected to the conditions in the factory.
Yeah.
And I sort of wouldn't have thought that the occupational health regulations in Mexico were that dramatically different from the United States. Can you just comment briefly on the differences between the factories themselves? What's it like to work in a factory in Galesburg versus?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the one in Galesburg is sort of a mashup of all these old buildings from almost each decade of Galesburg's history, because it's been there for something that's been produced on that spot for about a century, or what happened for about a century. And so it's just kind of this conglomeration of buildings. And but in Reynosa, it was very, very modern, very clean, looked like something you'd see in Silicon Valley. It looked like a warehouse, really, in some ways. And in some of the Maquilas have responsible owners, but in this case they were working with dangerous chemicals. Toluene is like a degreaser, and it's probably not bad if you use it a little bit, but for 13 years every day, and she's never really given gloves or instructions on just basic things. She had to go to her doctor, 10 years later, said, oh, you should wash your hands after you use that, that kind of stuff. And so, basically, the point is that they're modern, they're air-conditioned, they're nice in many ways to the eye, but the workers there don't really have a voice around wages, around working conditions, and so forth. The unions work more for the companies than they do for the workers. And so that's kind of the key problem in this case and others.
Perhaps this is a naive question, but I just wonder, like, why is it that these companies tend to treat their workers so poorly? Like, is it just straight greed, or do you think, I mean, it's likely more complicated than that because they can, because
they can, I think, yeah. So the way I describe it in the book is that there's a lack of a countervailing power. That's what John Kenneth Galbraith, I believe, called it. So you need, for a balanced system for even growth, or at least somewhat balanced growth, you need some kind of countervailing power to the corporations. I mean, if all this foreign investment coming in from the United States, from Asia, from Europe, and they have powerful industry groups, the Reynosa Maquiladora Association, other industry groups, and the federal government was at this time lined up on their side of the equation as well, and the unions are part of this as well. They act more as a labor relations unit of the corporation than as they did in Galesburg, which was as more of a voice of the workers. And so, in that kind of asymmetrical circumstance, you do what you can do. But I think a lot of people that were running these companies or are running these companies, and if they would see this kind of stuff, would probably be upset by it. When Paul O'Neill came down, for example, he used to be the Secretary of the Treasury, and he was maybe CEO of Coca-Cola, I believe. But he came down from the Maquiladora because some workers from the Maquiladoras came to talk to him and said, no, they're lying about working conditions. You come down and see it. And so he eventually realized, wow, okay, this is not as I've been told what it looked like, And so there's that, right? So these are kind of like isolated little islands of production that are their own worlds in some ways.
You sort of, in a way, seem to emphasize the nice aspects of the Maquiladoras and the associated towns, but it seems to me that I've heard in the past about rather high suicide rates, death rates, and way more sex trade in the area, that many women were involved in that. So it seemed to me that there are some rather unpleasant negative aspects of these towns across the border that were made worse by the presence of the industry.
Yeah, I think in chapter 7, well, you don't have to do it over.
I'll buy a copy.
I do make the argument that the rapid economic change at the border basically created an incubator or at least made the border a place where the kind of violence that we've seen there would be less difficult or more difficult to control, right? So the drug war starting in 2008, or at least the spikes in homicides that started in 2008, took place to a large extent at the border, right? And these places they're marked by what sociologists call social disorganization, where people they don't necessarily trust their neighbors, they don't know their neighbors, they're not as connected as they were in the rural villages of Veracruz, for example, not to romanticize what's happening in rural Mexico either, but that's a fact of life at the border, is social disorganization. And in that context, it's difficult for formal social controls to align with the kind of lacking informal social controls that people exercise at the street level, right? And so, the disappearances of women back in, I think, 2004, 2005 in Juarez, and then the spike in violence in the drug war, I think was abetted by the disorder and the chaos that the Maquilas and all this investment, which is good, you need investment, but there wasn't sort of the social infrastructure in place to deal with it, especially at the pace it was coming. In Coahuila, a state that's nearby, Reynosa, it saw $30 million of investment a week. Yeah. And so that's that's the kind of change that it's difficult for community to develop within. I thought I saw a question back there.
Well, I was wondering, you talked about the families that decided to stay in Galesburg, and this is kind of a speculative question, but do you think that that will continue to be true for future generations in that town, or
That's
do
a
you think
good
the
question.
future of that town will be?
That's a great question. That's a great question because. Oh, sure. It's so families have decided to stay. These people that were in midlife decided to stay. Oftentimes, some people left, of course. So the question is, what about their kids? What's going to happen to the next generation? Are they going to feel forced to leave? And I'm not sure that the railroad has provided some. It's helped. It's helped, and so that's a route. That's a legitimate pathway into the middle class. So, but for a lot of other people, if they graduate from Galesburg High School, the jobs that they see in front of them are at Lowe's and Walmart and the dentist's office or whatever. And so, I think all the people that I talk to are coaching their kids to got to go to college, get out of here. We hope you come back as a professional, and you can work at the hospital. But that's what you got to do. And so that's a good idea for a follow-up. Actually, 10 years.
Yeah.
I did the first 10 years and I did another 10.
You can get out my scheduling book.
Yeah.
So we're actually out of time, but in 10 years, come back for a follow-up. Thank you.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.